The more we talk about data ownership and all the opportunities data gives to the citizens and to the businesses, the more we are concerned with the question who actually has power over this data, who owns it, to use the buzzword. In law, the idea of ownership is strongly correlated to the idea of control, having control over something. But ownership itself is quite a complex concept. It implies something completely different in the ordinary language as in the legal terminology. Well, today I want to focus on personal data and individual ownership or control over personal data, in what form it exists under data protection law, and how it is challenged in the big data economy. I'll just skip the agenda. You'll see soon what follows. And let me start with a short case study, just to illustrate what's actually bothering us. We've already heard about the case of NHS and Google DeepMind agreement. That was an agreement on e-medical data transfer. How many of you are familiar with this case? It was briefly mentioned before, but okay, I'll just give you a few facts. Google DeepMind is a subsidiary of Google, obviously. It was founded by a British scientist, and among others, this is the company behind AlphaGo, the first program that won against a professional Go player. That was a huge thing. And Google DeepMind has one very strong objective, which is employing machine learning algorithms to find some super interesting correlations and insights in big data sets. So this is why they need a lot of data. And this is also one of the reasons that they entered in the data agreement with the NHS, the UK healthcare state healthcare system. The entire process of finalizing this agreement went by quite quickly. Actually, in July 2015, NHS was approached for the first time by Google DeepMind, and in September, the agreement was signed, and in November, the data started flowing. And initially, everyone was very much enthusiastic about this cooperation, but then soon some scientists, some researchers pointed at a few deficiencies of the agreement, mostly in relation to data protection laws. First of all, there was the consent problem, because to transfer these data, Google and the NHS used some specific legal vehicle, which is called healthcare relationship. So when there's something going on, when there's an app used as part of the healthcare relationship between a physician and a patient, there's no additional consent needed for this additional or specific data transfer. Everything can be wrapped up in this nice package of initial consent under this concept of healthcare relationship. So it was quite easy to get the valid legal basis for the data transfer. Also, patients were not given any notice about what's going on with their data, that data is suddenly transferred to Google servers in the States. There was no way once the data has left the UK and has been transferred to Google servers, there was no opportunity to track this data. And what's also interesting is that no authority was really involved in making this deal. Only after 2 years, and I learned last week that actually the Information Commissioner, the UK Data Protection Authority, issued a very negative opinion about this deal. But right from the beginning, there was no authority involved. It's not just those quite legalistic questions that pop up in relation to the specific data agreement. There are more open questions. There are questions related to power asymmetries on the market and in the society. Do we really want that very sensitive medical data is transferred to the world's largest advertising company? This is problematic, to say the least. And also this lack of meaningful agency individual empowerment and involvement in those sorts of data transfers. Having no notice, having no way to consent or disapprove data transfers is another issue here. Okay, but now back to the idea of legal ownership. For those of you that are not Slovenians, this is our president, Borut Pahor. He used to drive exactly this car when he traveled to work to the Slovenian parliament. What I want to say about this photo is actually that in some cases, legal ownership is quite simple one, quite simple concept. If we assume that Borut Pahor, the Slovenian president, is had legally purchased this car, then he's the legal owner, he's driver, he has the right to use, destroy, sell the car, do whatever he wants to. If we take another example, a Tesla car, things get a bit more complicated. It's not just the car that we talk about. There's also this huge stream of data that comes out of the car. Every ride with a Tesla generates a lot of valuable data that is a source of interest for several parties, starting with navigation system providers to improve their services, advertisers, knowing the driver's habits, where exactly he moves, to which shops he goes to which gas stations. These are all valuable information that advertisers can use to target this person better. Manufacturers, having information about the operation of the car is obviously a valuable source of information, and under certain conditions, also government wants to know more about what's going on with this car. So suddenly, the idea of ownership when it comes to data becomes much more complex. And we can see in these graphics what exactly are legal tools used to construct some sort of ownership over data. If we talk about large industrial databases, we usually use copyright if this is a creative database, or sui generis right, which is a special database right under the European law, which is used for databases in which we have invested a substantial amount of money and time. Trade secrets, another instrument that can be also used to protect database, public law provisions, I won't go into detail here, licenses to establish some access to data and regulate data flows. And last but not least, when we talk about personal data, a very important part of, a very important area of law is obviously data protection law. In the EU, the idea of control over personal data is an important principle, and it has been made explicit in some fundamental instruments under the EU law, starting with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Here we have the right on data protection in Article 8, which does not say explicitly individuals have control, but it does state that individuals have the right to access and the right to rectify their data. And in some sense, this is a reflection of control. Then in the GDPR, in the recital 13, which is not a binding text, but nevertheless, it's an important expression of the idea behind the GDPR rules, stipulating that natural persons should have control of their own personal data. And this control is really made explicit here. When it comes to more instrumental rules, I like to make the distinction between two types of entitlements under the GDPR, under data protection law. And I'm talking about GDPR today, even though it's not yet in force, but it's coming soon. So I think it's a justified reason. Okay, so under the GDPR, control is grounded in two parts of rules. The first part, the first cluster is related to consent, and the second cluster is related to control rights, data subject rights, also sometimes called subjective rights. This is the catalog that we see here. Data subject control rights, starting with the right to information, which is basically a duty of data controllers to provide information about different facts, who exactly processes the data, who is responsible for a specific data set, who is a recipient of particular data set, etc. What's important here is that the right to information is not just, it's not in place per se, but it's important as a conditio sine qua non. It's important for all the further rights. Without having information, without being aware of what's going on with your data, you're not able to make any other decision. You're not able to apply any other control right that's in there for you as an individual. The right to information. The right to access is actually analogous to the right to information. It comes later in the time in the course of data processing. You're able to receive the information about data processing, a bit narrower catalog, but still making you informed, making you aware of what's going on with your personal information. The right to erasure, or commonly known the right to be forgotten, is some sort of expression of the idea, restatement of the importance of control by giving you the possibility to withdraw your consent, and as a consequence, your data can be forgotten, can be deleted. And it's also a restatement of the principle of purpose limitation. When data can only be processed as long as this is necessary for the initial purpose, for the purpose that you have given consent for, but not for 100 other purposes. So that's basically about the right to be forgotten, data portability, the right not to be subject to decision based solely on automated decision making or automated processing. I won't go into detail because I guess I'm running out of time, right? I'll just skip to the final part. Big data revolution, which Frank Pasquale, the American scholar, described as a black box, obviously had quite some consequences, negative consequences, unfortunately, for data subject rights. I'll just give you a few examples to understand what's happening with the idea of control behind the entitlements that are in data protection law. To start with the right to information. Some people call it paper tiger. With such a huge overload of information, it's just impossible to really understand what this data implies. And on top of that, data is extremely complex. All the algorithms that are used to make decisions based on the data, that are used to get insight in the data, it's just not understandable to a layman, not even to computer scientists sometimes. There was a scientist working at Google stating that he cannot really explain the algorithm that he developed himself because it's completely unpredictable. So it's even more difficult for an individual, for a layman, for a lawyer, for example, to have this information. Then the right to be forgotten states that when data is used for a purpose that goes beyond what was agreed under the initial consent, this should be blocked, basically. But the thing is that once data is out there, it can be necessary for, it can be linked to some other database, it can be used for many, many purposes, and the final result is that data never gets unnecessary. So there will always be a reason to use this specific byte of data. Then data sharing, data flowing to several parties, hundreds of different recipients being used for the second, third, fourth purpose. It's just impossible to really capture these data that's flowing all around. And then, of course, technical limits. The research has shown that when the right to be forgotten is applied in 30 to 40%, the links are still identifiable. So it doesn't work perfectly. And finally, the right to data portability, and this also goes to the right to not to be subject to automated decision-making. It's extremely open. There was one opinion issued by the Article 29 Working Party a few months ago. Then there was another opinion issued by the same body. And now we heard from the European Commission that they actually disagree with the interpretation by the Data Protection Authority on the European level, which is quite ridiculous, in my opinion. Anyway, this just shows how complex this has become and that there are quite some challenges that we face. To conclude, I don't want to convey too negative a message here. So I have also envisioned some solutions to this lack of control and some sort of failure of control rights. First of all, I see a lot of opportunities in technical tools, such as My Data initiative that started in Scandinavia and is now also backed by the European Commission. Then blockchain technology can also be used, and it's already used in some cases to back consent initiatives and also to enable easier access to data and easier control over data. Then some novel regulatory visions, which is basically the idea that we should not put that much burden on individuals, but rather transfer the burden on data protection authorities, giving them additional funding, giving them additional resources, and maybe this can happen with the higher fines under the GDPR. And then finally, the approach that I believe in, it's the most promising one, and that's the holistic approach. With all the challenges that we've seen in relation to control rights, I think we should use legal tools from different legal areas to strengthen data subject rights. For example, consumer protection law has been changing quite substantially. In the past few months, there has been a proposal on the digital content directive, which basically gives some additional tools and some additional rights to consumers. And maybe if those two separate legal areas go more hand in hand, we can have we can envision some further solutions for data subjects. I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you very much for attention.